Welcome to this live event honoring Ida B. Wells. This is one in a series of 6 events hosted by the Center for the Study of the American South in collaboration with other campus units and community partners, including the Chapel Hill-Carborro NAACP and the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition.
The Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition is a collaboration of local organizations and individuals committed to disrupting structural racism through truth-telling and hard conversation to achieve community healing and justice for all.
No single person has contributed more to addressing the horror of racial terror lynching in this country than Ida B. Wells, emphasizing the importance of courageous journalism in moving us forward in our quest for a more equitable and just society.
We hope you enjoy this live event.
Good evening. I am Dianne Jackson, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the history of racial terror and lynchings in Orange County. Our panelists are Paris Miller, Seth Kotch, Matt Sheldon, Kayla Keaton, Allison Jemison, and Melanie Winters. I will share brief bios of each panelist. A more detailed version is found on the website for this seminar. Paris Miller is a member of the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition and serves on the boards of Empowerment and the Marion Cheek Jackson Center in Chapel Hill. Recently, she was appointed to the Community Policing Advisory Council to the town of Chapel Hill. Prior, Miller was an English professor at St. Augustine University in Raleigh before moving abroad with her family to teach English in Abu Dhabi for 4 years. She also taught at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro in undergraduate studies. Seth Kotch is the director of the Southern Oral History Program and is an associate professor in American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Kotch has produced several digital projects, including a red record, a student-driven project exploring the history of lynching in the American South and mapping the Long Woman's Movement, an experiment aimed at empowering researchers to explore oral history in new ways. He also served as a project supervisor on the Civil Rights History Project, which is administered by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. He received his PhD and Master's in History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Matt Sheldon is entering his 19th year in the classroom as an educator. He has spent all of these years at Middle Creek High School in Wake County, where he has taught 9th grade English, African American literature, and most recently, piloting a new course he and his students call Hard History and Civic Engagement. Matt holds a national board certification and proudly served as the 2015-16 Wake County Teacher of the Year. Kayla Keaton is a senior at Middle Creek High School. Ida B. Wells Symposium is her 14th event as a student speaker. Since working with the Equal Justice Initiative, she's discussed the role of race in education, police brutality, and remote learning at multiple forums. She's the founder and president of her school's Social Justice Club and has collaborated with the Raleigh Apex NAACP to produce a video in the midst of current protests. Allison Jemison is a senior at Raleigh Charter High School and a member of the Freedom Struggle Committee. As a part of this committee, Allison believes that we cannot be complacent about the history and repercussions of racial terror. Melody Winter is a history teacher at Raleigh Charter High School and advisor to the Freedom Struggle Committee. She is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and a proud Badger. She now calls North Carolina her home. We look forward to a wonderful presentation by our panelists, and at this time, I will turn it over to Paris Miller.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dianne Jackson. Good evening. I'm honored to be a part of this month-long symposium that centralizes the work of America's greatest anti-lynching activist, Miss Ida B. Wells. Wells said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." This evening, we are shedding light on the lives lost to racial terror lynching in Orange County, North Carolina. But by no means do I believe that what will be presented is a complete illumination of the lives lost, for not every atrocity has left behind a trail for us to follow. And so they will remain ghosts, haunting. As for those we know, I will say their names in an attempt to honor their memory. The accounts of lynchings presented tonight can be found on the website research project, A Red Record, directed by Elijah Gaddis and my esteemed panelist, Seth Kotch, and from the research of Mike Ogle for OCCRC. I will focus most of this evening's time together on the periods between 1865 to 1898. It is important to define what racial terror lynching is, and to steep these tellings of terror within the historical context of Orange County, right after the Civil War and during the period of Reconstruction. So what constitutes racial terror lynching? Although popular images of lynching usually conjure up a hanging, an image now immortalized by Billie Holiday's famous rendition of the haunting song, Strange Fruit, other forms of murder and violence can also be called lynching, such as killing by torture, mutilation, burning, shooting, and dragging. What distinguishes lynchings from all other forms of murder is not any specific type of violence, but the lyncher's claims to justification and social legitimacy. Racial terror lynching involved African Americans being accused of an alleged crime by a white mob, deprived of their life without due process and equal protection of the law. Crime or no crime, the reality is that African Americans could be vulnerable to white racial terror for failing to adhere to racial etiquettes meant to maintain white supremacy. After the Civil War, lynching became a tool to punish, push back, and undo the gains of recently freed African Americans. Like the rest of the South, Orange County was reeling after the end of a bloody Civil War and the collapse of an economic system built on slave labor, all in the face of Northern Union military rule and occupation. For many whites and former Confederates in Orange County, life under these conditions were unacceptable. And the state's darling university, which was an educational bastion of white male slaveholding aristocracy, was now under the control of Union soldiers who had stabled their horses in Smith Hall, the university library. With the 1868 election of Republican William Holden as governor of North Carolina, there was a shift in the electoral balance of power. Newly politically empowered African Americans were successfully gathered under the Republican banner. The invasion, occupation, economic depression, and political weakening of those who served the Confederacy would transform Orange County into a center of organized white supremacist resistance to the social revolution being forced upon a defeated people and their privileged way of life. There were accounts of small armies of Klan members riding silently down Franklin Street. Other accounts have the Klan riding through the campus, beating Blacks, and making a Black Republican leader take an oath of allegiance to the Democratic Party. It is important to note here the role of Klan activity in establishing mob violence as a powerful and effective means of suppressing African American political participation and maintaining white supremacy, to which Southerners would return again and again and again. Chapel Hill lawyer James Mason wrote Governor Holden, stating, "It has become no uncommon thing to see 40 to 50 Ku Klux routing up and down the streets of this village at the late hour of 12 o'clock. The centers of Klan activity were in Jones, Lenoir, Chatham, and Orange County. In 1869, Governor Holden declared those counties in a state of insurrection, and he vowed to break the Klan. He subsequently employed 20 detectives to assist him, but his efforts did little to nothing to deter Klan activity. For on August 7th, 1869, Jefferson and Daniel Morrow were lynched for barn burning and the added vague charge of insulting a white woman. Reports at the time indicated that the lynch mob left a note identifying themselves as the KKK. Newspaper accounts described what happened Sunday, July 8th, when a band of armed horsemen, about 75 in number, who overtook the jail and carried the Negroes out of town. The mob was described in detail as wearing long white gowns as white as a lily. A shrouding sheet hung over their face with just 2 holes for their eyes. The Klan threatened the 2 brothers at gunpoint before deciding their innocence and releasing them. At some point during this encounter, one of the brothers was shot and wounded. But in August, both of their bodies would be found hanging, signs on their backs plastered for barn burning and threats. A month later, on Sunday, September 12th, 1869, the dead body of Wright Woods was found with a note attached to his foot that read, "If the law will not protect virtue, the rope will." Woods' alleged crime was attempted rape. Lynching and rape formed a web of racist sexual politics aimed at subjugating Southern Blacks. In her pamphlet, Southern Horrors, Ida B. Wells attacked the rape myth, which she believed served as the justification for all lynchings. She focused on Southern sexual politics and the clandestine interracial relationships between white women and Black men that formed the backdrop to many lynchings inspired by rape allegations. 2 months after Wright Woods' killing, Cyrus Guy would meet the same fate. His body was found near the Alamance County line, left hanging in a tree at the intersection of Fawcett Mill and Lebanon Road. A note attached to his body read, "For insulting white ladies." The lynching of Cyrus Guy can be found in the Federal Writers Project of 1936 to 1938 oral narrative interview of formerly enslaved Ben Jonson. According to Johnson, Guy was lynched by the Ku Klux Klan and his body was to hang, untouched. And if anyone tried to remove the body, they too would hang. And so Guy's body remained, as Johnson described, swinging in the wind. By the fourth day, the sheriff came and retrieved his body. Guy's death marked 4 lynchings within a 5-month period. He was later buried in the Orange County Poorhouse Cemetery. Also told in Johnson's account is the narrative of formerly enslaved individuals Ed and Cindy, who right after the Civil War were asked to leave the home of their former owner, Mr. Lynch, within a month's time. When they failed to comply, the Klan abducted, whipped, and threw them into a frozen pond, their bodies breaking the ice. Ed emerged, but Cindy was never seen again. At the end of Johnson's narrative, he recalls the 1869 lynching of a Mr. Joe Turner in Hillsborough, but he couldn't remember what he had been hanged for. By 1870, there was a statewide campaign to oust Governor Holden, and on December 14th, he was impeached and the Democrats were thus back in control. This political power struggle would ebb back and forth between the two parties. But by 1898, the Democrats would launch successful self-proclaimed white supremacist campaigns that led to the racial terror massacre and the nation's first coup d'etat governmental overthrow in Wilmington, North Carolina on November 10th, 1898. One of the major perpetrators of the Wilmington overthrow was Charles Aycock, who would be elected governor of North Carolina from 1901 to 1905. On that same day of the Wilmington massacre, the body of Manly Macaulay would still be hanging outside of Chapel Hill. The then 18-year-old Manly had eloped with Maggie Brewer, a married white woman of 3. The two fled Orange County, but were later captured by a posse formed by Brewer's husband. Macaulay was taken back to Chapel Hill, and on the night of Sunday, October 30th, 1898, Macaulay was taken to the woods near the intersection of Old Greensboro and Hatchet Road and hanged. His body would remain swinging from a low-hanging dogwood tree for 10 days. And on the 10th day, 150 miles away, Wilmington would be on fire. Thank you. And at this time, I turn it over to Seth Kotch.
Thanks so much, Paris, for that remarkable presentation. Of course, I'm just sitting in my bedroom looking at a computer screen, so I can't tell if anyone can see or hear me, but I'm going to pretend that that's the case. It's a huge privilege to be here, and I want to thank the Center for the Study of the American South and the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition for inviting me, and to Ms. Dianne Jackson for the introduction, and to my fellow panelists who have really helped me a great deal understand the value of doing this kind of work. When I talk about lynching with my undergraduate students at Carolina, I like to start by showing them this image. And I ask them to just say what they see. And many of them immediately see the state of North Carolina. And I think that many of us, myself, a Chapel Hill resident, born and raised in Orange County, have comforted ourselves that Chapel Hill, because we often vote blue, can congratulate ourselves for our progressivism. And I think that many of us who have been insulated from some of these other histories by our privilege have failed to see clearly the way in which we're all implicated in the story. And this, of course, is a map of North Carolina, which demonstrates that although North Carolina had fewer lynchings than many other southern states, most lynchings in America take place in the deep South, Louisiana, Florida, Mississippi, that there was no place in North Carolina you could be at any point between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s where a lynching had not taken place fairly nearby. We have a lynching in Cherokee County. In the far west of the state, we've got lynchings in the northeast part of the county, which is historically 60-40 African-American and the site of considerable Black political engagement. And of course, we have lynchings throughout the Piedmont, including in Orange County. So what was lynching? and was lynching. Paris sort of described what racial terror lynching was. And I want to mention that as activists at the time, those who followed in Ida B. Wells' footsteps in the 20th century, as they were trying to end the practice of lynching through legislation which failed repeatedly because of filibusters in the Senate, including by North Carolina senators, and through activism and shaming, they were counting lynchings and publishing them in the newspaper, annual counts, monthly counts. And the reason they were counting lynchings was, firstly, they wanted to illustrate how bad the problem was. If a lynching is happening on average weekly or daily in the southern United States, it needs to be drawn attention to. But at the same time, their goal was to reach zero, to someday declare that lynching was over. And ultimately they did, right around the end of World War II, 1946, 1947, we basically stopped counting. And I'll address why that I think that's a little bit problematic towards the end of this brief talk. But the NAACP and the Chicago Defender and the Tuskegee Institute debated what should constitute a lynching. And they came up with a definition that they actually never solidified, but it's as close to what I think an understanding is of what the counters counted when they were counting. So they thought that a lynching had to include 3 or more people. It had to be a mob, right? There had to be a death that resulted. And there had to be some reference to justice or custom. It couldn't just be a bunch of racists in a brawl. It couldn't be an individual encounter between a white man and a black man, for example. It had to be something that was a little bit more significant than that. And as you see here, this is another passage from the lynching of Wright Woods in 1869. You'll note, as Paris pointed out, that the mob actually left a note on the body of Wright Woods saying, if the law will not protect virtue, the rope will. And this was a signal that the mob was there to use white women as sort of conduits to punish black men. But I've been guilty of saying over and over again, you know, someone was lynched for an accusation of rape, for something of this nature. And I realize increasingly that I think the language that we use around lynching needs to change, because we're allowing the mob, when they describe their own actions, to control the narrative about how we talk about lynchings generations and generations later. Because in fact, Wright Woods was lynched for being black. It's secondary that he may or may not have done something, and it's secondary that he was accused of something else, because a white person who did exactly what Wright Woods did would not have been lynched. So his blackness is the key factor in his death. What we think we know about lynching: we think there were about 175 documented lynchings in North Carolina during this period, and 5,000 in the South as a whole. But as Paris so importantly shows us, there are lynchings that are not documented. There are lynchings that are underdocumented. There are lynchings that are not reported that we don't know about. And that has affected how we think about this. The Equal Justice Initiative, who's doing amazing work in commemoration, they start their project in 1877. And so we're missing some of these important stories, which is why I so appreciate the work of the OCCRC and how, in addition to working on lynchings that took place after 1877, they're also looking at these previous incidents in the late 1860s. We know that, as you saw on the map, lynchings are geographically widespread in North Carolina. Although generally, as I said, they're regionally concentrated in the Deep South. Lynching is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to the South. However, it is a phenomenon that is dominated by Southern states. Lynching also is politically, culturally, and socially important. It is a way to, again, echoing Paris, to reduce mobility, to reduce wealth, to take land, and sometimes actually to increase mobility, to drive Black people from the South. It was a way to increase the mobility and the power of white elites and their allies and the sort of lower class white people who were being offered white supremacy rather than good paying jobs, or rather than a functional place in the Southern aristocracy, offering them something for nothing. And it was also an important demand for an institutional space to harm Black people and to kill Black people, and ultimately other people of color as well, and other non-white Protestant Christians. And that demand really drives the history of lynching in North Carolina. And you see that demand being made in that note on Wright Woods's body that is saying, we will take this space if you don't create it for us. There's a lot also that we don't know about lynching. We don't know, as I said, enough about what's happened between the end of the Civil War and 1877, which is this period called Reconstruction, when, as again, Paris mentioned, the South is divided into occupied military zones, and there's an effort to get Southern states sort of reintegrated into a functional United States. That ends in 1877 with a process called redemption, which is another history written by the victors kind of title, because the white supremacist, racist Southern men wanted to rebuild the South in an image that to echo enslavement as best as possible. We don't know enough about the lives of lynching's victims and their families and descendants. We don't know enough about countless under or undocumented lynchings. And we don't know enough about attempted lynchings. If someone escapes a lynching by a white mob, it's not clear to me why we should not document that in the same way that we document people who were not so lucky. And one crucial thing to know about lynching is how closely lynching operated with the legal system. First of all, lynching is not really illegal. I mentioned that the federal efforts to pass anti-lynching legislation failed. So we never had a mechanism to bring the federal government into the South. Not that there was particular interest in that. But it's also basically not illegal in many instances in the communities where the lynchings are taking place. It's part of policing traditions in the South, which go back to slave patrols in the 1600s. Lynching in places where there is not a robust criminal justice infrastructure is one way that white mobs seek to control Black people and their futures. And it's often condoned by the legal system. Lynchings basically don't result in convictions. Police, sheriffs, and others might participate or look the other way. And the courts play along. I was intrigued in doing research to find references to the phrase legal lynching in the 1800s, being used by Black activists to describe the hasty and racist conviction of Black defendants in courtrooms before all white juries. And so the consensus among many white people in the South at the time, but crucially, the consensus sort of between the mob and the government, is that lynching is useful, that lynching accomplishes a purpose. I'll share a brief anecdote to illustrate what I mean by legal lynching. In 1927, there was a Black man named Larry Newsom who was accused of the crime of rape. His victim was a white woman, or I should say, here I am using that language again, the person who was described as a victim was a white woman. And a mob actually formed itself in the courtroom when he was on trial in Superior Court for his life. And this was a time in North Carolina when a conviction of rape would result in a mandatory immediate death sentence. So Raleigh Speller, Larry Newsom, sorry, I'm thinking of another person who underwent this nightmare. Larry Newsom in 1927 has an attempted lynching made on him in the courtroom. The judge actually has to draw a gun and hold it on the mob, warning them that he'll kill them unless they settle down. Everyone settles down. The trial is resumed in the presence of state militiamen with bayoneted rifles. And Larry Newsom, not surprisingly, receives a death sentence very quickly. It's 60 hours, I believe, from the time of his arrest to the time of his death sentence, and he is ultimately executed. And one juror later wrote about the experience of sitting in the jury with a mob gathered in the courtroom and basically said, listen, we know what would happen to us if we did anything other than give them what they wanted. And so we had to do what we had to do. And the next day, though, the News and Observer celebrated the judge for defending justice, here in one of the worst political cartoons I've ever seen. But here we have a judge holding a pistol, defending justice. And there was an editorial that accompanied this cartoon that basically said, there's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do it. And we did it the right way. So lynching was a demand for an institutional space to harm and kill Black people. Where are the institutional spaces historically and in the present where white people harm and kill Black people? We see this every day on social media. It's happening in our schools, in our court system, in our prison system, and in our jails. It happens in neighborhoods. It happens on city streets. It happens at our pools. It happens in our parks, and the list goes on. And so we return to this question of what does it mean that at some point we declared an end to lynching? And what does it mean to talk about racial violence and other forms of violence, other forms of neglect in the context of lynching ending? So I'd ask you, just as I close, to take a look at this list and think about the segregated schools that many of us send our children to and the segregated neighborhoods that we live in because of redlining means that Black families can't get loans in order to move into certain places, the police brutality and murder that African-American men and women face, not to mention other BIPOC people, the police neglect that is sort of the flip side of that for the police brutality. So never being able to find a balance between an appropriate protective police presence and one that's a threat, wealth inequality and generational wealth inequality, health inequality and generational health inequality, infant mortality for Black babies, environmental racism that continues to make poor Black and brown people sick, aging Black kids up in classrooms and expelling them or suspending them at higher rates, mass incarceration, voting interference, a lack of accommodation since the absence of the color of flesh-colored types being generally the color of white people's skin, and harassment. And we have to ask ourselves, if we remove lynching from this list of lynching's legacies, this place that lynching occupied at the very top of this pyramid, the most scary and incandescently violent thing that was happening, if we replace it, how then do we think about the way our state, our region, and our country is functioning? And now I'll turn it over to Matt Sheldon and Kayla.
Thank you so much, Seth. So before we get rolling, I want to take this opportunity to thank the OCCRC and the Chapel Hill-Carborro NAACP and UNC Chapel Hill for hosting this event and for inviting us to it. We really appreciate it, the opportunity to share with the community what we've been working on over the past couple of years. And we hope that what we've done in the past couple of years in some small way honors the mission of Ida B. Wells to shine a light of truth, but also to attempt to honor Nelson Mandela's call for reconciliation in our communities. So the picture you're seeing here, that's Kayla on the far left and me at what is undoubtedly my best moment as a teacher, my favorite moment. I'm so happy that a picture exists of this moment. This is us in the pulpit at Dexter Ave Baptist Church down in Montgomery. And nothing's gonna meet this moment. So I want to share with you how we got there. Next slide, please. So in the fall of 2017, I found myself reading Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. And I was barely halfway through it when I knew that I wanted to share this book with my students in my African American literature class. As we were moving through that class, I consistently saw that the students were oftentimes more interested in the context that I was providing for them, the historical context, than they were in the actual literary text that we were going to study. When we were talking about narratives of enslavement, they wanted to talk and study more about the middle passage. When we were talking about the Harlem Renaissance, they really wanted to spend more time to learn about and talk about the Great Migration that led to the Harlem Renaissance. So about halfway through the book, I knew that I wanted to bring this in because this would provide that nonfiction, the real life experiences that they wanted to learn about. So of course, that led me to wanting to learn more about what Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative were working on right now. Because of course, many of you I know have read the book or seen the movie that tells the story of how the Equal Justice Initiative was started up by Bryan Stevenson. So I wanted to see where they are today. So that brought me to checking into the Equal Justice Initiative now. Next slide, please. So that brought me first to their work with the Lynching in America report. And we knew at that time they were getting ready to open their National Memorial for Peace and Justice, what is commonly known as the Lynching Memorial, and also their Legacy Museum in Montgomery. It was going to be opening up in April. And as I zoomed in, and of course you look at a map like this, you see America, you zoom in, you want to see the South. Of course you zoom in, you want to see what's going on in North Carolina. And of course they broke it down county by county. So I looked at our county, Wake County, and saw that we had one confirmed lynching case, that of George Taylor on November the 5th, 1918. And through looking at what the EJI was doing with not only shining a light on this history, they were also moving towards reconciliation by offering these community remembrance projects where community organizations would research and put together a narrative of those lynching cases, but also conduct a soil collection as close to the site of the lynching as possible. And then that soil would go down and be enshrined and become a part of the permanent holdings at the Legacy Museum down in Montgomery. And of course, I knew that was the work I wanted to do with my students. So I reached out to Equal Justice Initiative, and come to find out, there were already 2 schools in the area that had recently reached out to them wanting to do the same work. My esteemed colleague, Ms. Shannon Hardy at Exploris Middle School here in Raleigh, and my other esteemed colleague, Ms. Melanie Winter, who you'll hear from in a minute, at Raleigh Charter, they also had reached out to the Equal Justice Initiative wanting to participate in this community remembrance project. So of course, we jumped on board and we were ready to move. And we knew the first thing that needed to happen was we needed to get our hands on that archival material and start doing the research to put together the narrative of what happened to George Taylor on that day. So I want to turn it over to Kayla so that you can hear the student's perspective of this project.
Right, thank you, Mr. Shadon. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Kayla Keaton. I am a senior at Middle Creek High School, and I've spent my entire K-12 career in Wake County Public Schools. Well, for most seniors, that means we are excited for graduation this year. For me, I see that as having taken all of the history requirements on American history and North Carolina history and North Carolina requires of me, and realizing that lynching was not mentioned in any one of these classes. If it were not for me taking Mr. Shadon's English elective, this word would not even be in my vocabulary at all. And that is understandable to an extent, because lynching is not a subject that is very easy to understand. You don't want to understand that it is real, which is why doing the investigation with my classmates and getting really involved and just getting close to the information through this investigation, intertwining George Taylor's story with ours, is what inspired us to get engaged with the material instead. So what did we do for our investigation? We started to get the general information from a read record by Dr. Kotch. We used his source as our foundation for further research. From there, we used news articles from 1918 to compare the details, find consistent things from article to article, and compile them into one narrative to tell his story. From there, we also used maps from 1918 as well as Google Maps once we got some of the geographic details to match along with our narrative to pinpoint the location in Roseville, North Carolina. So what is the story of George Taylor? It's very similar to that definition Dr. Kotch described earlier. A white woman was sexually assaulted in her home when her husband was away on a business trip. The authorities brought 3 men to her house. She looked at all 3 of the men and said, "That is not the man." On his way out, she heard George Taylor's voice. And then all of a sudden, she changed her mind and said, "Nope, this is the guy." In transit to jail, 3 hooded men kidnapped George Taylor, held him in a ravine, tortured him for hours, dragged him across the street, hanged him, and shot over 100 bullets at his body. 300 people were present at his lynching. Not a single person was held accountable. And it's that unsatisfying ending of justice unserved is what inspired my classmates to develop the Citizens Promise, to do 3 things for people today. To 1, acknowledge and remember the victims of injustice, such as George Taylor. His story was unheard of in our county until 2 years ago, which is really weird to think about. 2, to create an opportunity for reconciliation within our community, whether it's something as large as an entire lynching investigation or something as small as sharing his story. And 3, to promise to no longer remain silent in the face of white supremacy, because it does, it has, and it will continue to hurt us all. So we went outside of the classroom with this. Not only did we actually visit the site in Roseville, North Carolina, but we also went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And as my classmates and I, we walked through the memorial, all of the pillars symbolically hanging above us. We saw George Taylor's very close to the end, which I think it's almost like destiny that his was at the very end of our trip. And we all stood there silently and we saw his name, the name we've been studying for so long through our entire semester, hanging above us in an entirely different state. And I think it was that moment that really made us realize that this was more than just a class project or a participation grade. It was bigger than all of us, which is what inspired us to keep going. My fellow classmates, they did the soil collection with the Equal Justice Initiative. While the property owner declined to allow the soil collection, they did something even better with this opportunity. They got 300 community soil samples to represent the 300 people not held accountable for his lynching, and delivered it to the Equal Justice Initiative in 2019. From there, we did our truth-telling part of the Truth and Reconciliation campaign. We told George Taylor's story to the Wake County commissioners. We spoke at museums, at education events. We did interviews and podcasts. We did everything that we could to get his story out there, as well as help other educators implement the same type of civic engagement projects in their own classrooms. And outside of the school system, we inspired the creation of the Wake County Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They are specifically working with George Taylor's story to bring back the duplicate panel created by the Equal Justice Initiative to represent not only his life, but also the countless other unknown victims of lynching in Wake County.
So as word of this project started to spread in our area, we got reached out to from Mr. Lynn Council, who was 86 at the time. And it turns out he had a story that he had only ever shared with his close family members and close friends. And he was ready, after hearing what the students had done with the George Taylor Project, to share his narrative with the larger community. In short, in 1952, Mr. Council was 19 years old. He was arrested along with a handful of his teenage friends, and they were accused of robbing a nearby store, a crime that they had nothing to do with. Mr. Council, being the oldest of them, was taken from his jail cell by the then Wake County Sheriff and the then Chief of Apex Police, and he was taken out, and there was, for lack of a better term, a mock lynching, where they were trying to scare him into admitting to a crime that he would not commit, where they kept hoisting him up on it with a rope to choke him, to try and get him to give up to say that he had done it when he had done nothing of the sort. And he finally reached out to us and shared that story with my students, showed on the back of his neck where the scar still remains from that rope. And that led us to the Truth and Reconciliation campaign in his behalf. So we reached out to local news sources to get the truth out there about his case. And the reconciliation process took us to the current Wake County Sheriff's Office and the current Apex Chief of Police. Both of those men offered an apology to Mr. Council and have taken down memorials to those previous law enforcement officials as a step forward in owning that history and trying to do better for their communities. Gillian.
So, my classmates and I, we wanted to continue with this work. They went to the Wake County School Board and asked for a follow-up class to African American Literature Honors called Hard History and Civic Engagement. We would specifically focus on the people and the social movements that our traditional history classes just did not cover, such as the North Carolina Eugenics Program and the 1898 Wilmington Massacre. And towards the end of our semester, as everyone knows, we saw the murder of George Floyd. We just heard the results of the Breonna Taylor case. We saw the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Everything we were learning and studying so closely in class, we kept seeing it happen in real life. And the worst part is we kept seeing the same result. So with that knowledge, especially after passing all of his classes and being more prepared for the real world, my classmates and I, as well as Mr. Chaldon, we know that this work is not yet done. Thank you so much. I will now pass it over to Mrs. Winter and Allison.
Thank you so much, Kayla and Matt, for sharing the work that you're doing. My name is Melanie Winter, and as Dianne mentioned, I am a history teacher and advisor at Raleigh Charter High School, and I'm an advisor to a group of students whose goal is to erect a memorial in North Carolina to the lives lost to racial terror and lynching, to say their names, as Paris mentioned, to shed light on the lives lost. Thank you for sharing your time with us. It's an honor to be here as part of tonight's panel. And here with me is Allison Jemerson, one of the awesome and dedicated seniors in our committee that we've named the Freedom Struggle Committee. I'll now turn it over to Allison.
I'd like to begin by providing a framework for our discussion. Lynchings were racially motivated killings that were often observed by hundreds of people of all ages. There is a common image of an angry white mob stringing a black man up to a tree, but this is only half the story. Lynchings were an act of terror meant to spread fear among African Americans, serving the broad social purpose of maintaining white supremacy in the economic, social, and political spheres. Lynchings were justified as a source of protection, and this false sense of danger among communities made it acceptable to lynch Black people. Of these individuals, almost 3/4 were Black. Over 160 known lynchings were reported in North Carolina from 1865 to 1941 in letters, postcards, and newspapers. The legacy of lynchings is apparent, whether it's through our racialized criminal justice system, police brutality, mass incarceration, or hate crimes. We have a race problem in America, and by confronting this history of lynching, we can begin to solve the issue and create a more united country.
So to understand the legacy of racial terror, we need to look at the policies that began positioning white bodies above Black bodies. And the 17th century introduced this long traumatic process of the enslavement of Black Americans in North America. And on a policy level, slave codes were passed, defining whiteness and Blackness, giving white owners nearly total control over the lives of the enslaved. And you'll notice on the slide, the first entry refers to the John Punch case in Virginia. And John Punch ran away with 2 other indentured servants and received a life sentence of servitude by the General Court in Virginia, while the white indentured servants faced a much shorter sentence of a few years. And you'll notice in 1705 in Virginia and 1816 in North Carolina, slave codes, again, solidifying whiteness over Blackness. And we know that in 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, these statues were criminalized, as you can see. However, the constitutional exception, where slavery nor involuntary servitude can be used except as a punishment for crime, allows this constitutional exception to those who are incarcerated to be forced to work involuntarily, as Allison will discuss.
After slavery was abolished and the 13th Amendment passed, white supremacists still sought ways to re-enslave African Americans. They introduced Black codes in the early years of Reconstruction, which were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans, ensure the availability of cheap labor force, and legally punish them. These Black codes led to sanctioned legal terror of Black citizens in North Carolina and other southern states. Former slaves fought to assert their independence and gain economic autonomy. However, Black codes made that extremely difficult. Many freed slaves were forced to sign labor contracts and were arrested if they refused or left early. For example, in 1865, Mississippi law stated that all African Americans and biracial citizens over the age of 18 had to obtain or renew their labor contracts on the second Monday in January each year. If they didn't, they would be deemed vagrant, meaning they would be convicted, fined, and imprisoned. To the right is an example of a Mississippi labor contract. A quote from this labor contract states 2 families were, quote, to work on said farm and to cultivate 40 acres in corn and 20 acres in cotton, to assist in putting the fences on said farm in good order and to keep them so, and to do all other work on said farm necessary to be done, to keep the same in good order and to raise a good crop, and to be under the control and directions of said I.G. Bailey, and to receive for their said services 1/2 of the cotton and 1/3 of the corn and fodder raised by them on said farm in said year, 1867, end quote. Sharecroppers barely received what they worked for, causing many of them to go into debt in an attempt to support their families. African Americans were essentially trapped by these labor contracts. Black citizens were also arrested for the simplest crimes. A 1867 law stated that a white and Black person could not get married. Oftentimes, the Black person would be convicted of a felony to receive harsher punishments. One North Carolina law named reckless eyeballing stated that even looking at a white person could be called criminal assault under the law. To the right, you see a photograph of Matt Ingram. In 1951, Ingram was accused and convicted of reckless eyeballing for simply looking at his neighbor, who was a young white woman. Although he was around 75 feet away from her, she felt scared. Ingram spent 2 years in jail before the NAACP got involved and helped get him out. He was one of the last persons to be convicted of reckless eyeballing. However, the consequences of a Black man looking at a white person didn't end there. In April 2015, Freddie Gray was inexplicably murdered in the back of a police van. The police altercation began when Gray looked a police in the eyes. He was only 25 years old. These restrictive laws not only affected the relationship between white and African Americans today, but they were the beginning of mass incarceration. They re-enslaved Black people by dubbing them as criminals instead of slaves.
And Black codes, as Frederick Douglass said, merely replaced slavery with some other name. Reforms in the late 1860s brought legal protections that hadn't been in place before. For example, the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. And when we look at the bold print, it was the first time that citizenship was defined in the Constitution on a national level. It also ensured that all citizens had the right to due process of law, and all persons had the right to due process of law, as well as equal protection of the laws, which did include the formerly enslaved.
The Freedom Struggle Committee has recognized the significance of the history the United States has, which is why we are dedicated to developing a memorial to serve as a permanent public acknowledgement to the victims of lynching in North Carolina. We will continue to learn from our history in order to promote truth and reconciliation of our past and build a better future.
And you'll see at the bottom to learn more about the Freedom Struggle Committee. You can visit our website there, and you can also follow us on Instagram at RCHS Freedom Struggle. And as we end, I would like to end with this question, Allison. What is this project? What has it meant to you?
Working on this project with my peers has meant everything to me. It started off as a project that was done with a group of sophomores who are now sophomores in college. And so we have just been continuing to carry on their legacy and doing work with them. And as Kayla mentioned earlier, that this work, we realized it was bigger than us, especially seeing the recent unprovoked killings of Black people. So we decided that this was more than just a small project at school. This needed to be something that was recognized by the country, and we all are very passionate about the work that we're doing and feel like if we can get past this history and have a real discussion about it, it will make our country a better place.
All right, thank you so much for listening to our presentation. And with that, I think I turn it over to Dianne, I believe.
Thank you, panelists. This was an amazing presentation. And I'm going to start with one question that came from one of the people working with this group. And any one of you can answer. Did Ida B. Wells document any North Carolina lynchings in their publications that you all are aware of?
So in my research, and thank you, Dianne, for that question, I didn't find any, and I was really, really looking for some mention of North Carolina, but in my research, I didn't find any. Seth, what about for you? Are you aware of any?
I'm not aware of any, but it's been a while since I've read. Working in the 1880s and on, a lot of her material is no longer under copyright and it's widely available online. And so I definitely encourage myself to refresh my memory by just doing some Googling and everyone here to look it up and read it.
Okay. Another question is, what was the role of faith communities, especially clergy, in supporting lynchings?
So I answered this a little bit in the Q&A with some text that people can check out if they want to. The 2 questions and 2 answers that I'm not really able to give. So we do know that members of Black churches organized against lynching and were part of creating a narrative about lynching, pushing back against it and attempting to destabilize it. We do know that some white clergy did take stands of some kind against lynching, but we also know that that was not the case for all of them by any means. We don't know what was said at the pulpits on Sunday mornings in churches across North Carolina. We do know that in communities with a variety of different churches of different denominations, black and white, there were more lynchings, which suggests that there was some sort of religious tension or an absence of community in those places that left certain people vulnerable. We also know that a lot of the historical work on the role of Christianity in lynching has to do with the ways in which lynch mobs seem to be evoking the sort of rituals of Christianity. Lynching was often a ritual practice. There were certain things that we did. What those rituals did was draw together the way the law looked, like the noose, right? The noose is what sheriffs used to hang people, right? That's a symbol of the law. So we draw together what the law looks like, and we draw together with that with what Christianity looks like. And the suffering Black person who is dying for their own sins is, in the argument of these historians and others, sort of taking on this Christ-like image in order to sort of wash away the sins of the South. And I think it's a really compelling idea. It's really hard to demonstrate evidence of exactly what the intention was, because we simply don't, these things were sometimes documented, surprisingly so, right? They were sometimes advertised in newspapers beforehand, but we also don't know, what was in the hearts of these people, and they didn't produce a lot of language about it. But one thing that historians have argued is that evangelical Christianity, with its themes of suffering and vengeance and redemption, paired very tightly with the lynching rituals and this idea of sort of flushing out sin through blood sacrifice.
To piggyback off that as well, Seth, like when we look at a lot of the newspaper clippings, we see a lot of talk about, post-Civil War and during the period of Reconstruction, this falling of African Americans, how they had kind of like fallen into debauchery and their own self-agency and freedom was bad for them in some way. And so that's definitely in line with this purifying of Black folks through lynching.
Yeah, this is like the rhetoric of moral degradation, right? That the South does need to be redeemed, and it's redeemed through Black people and Black lives, but not in the way that we need now. It's redeemed through this destruction. That's really spot on.
Okay. Another question, what was the role of UNC Chapel Hill in supporting or being complicit in the lynchings?
So the history with UNC is very, very interesting. I mean, as I stated in my presentation, it was really where slaveholders, let's think about who had the money to be able to send their kids to university to get an education. And it was the slaveholders. And so UNC was really this cycle of aristocracy, of wealth within the area. And UNC was the flagship university. And so it was held in high honor. And Union soldiers understood this. When the Civil War started, the classrooms were emptied of students, and the young men signed up immediately to fight on the side of the Confederacy. And so when the war ended and the Union came, people were distraught. And not only did the federal government come and take over and occupy the state and send troops, but they also sent specifically to UNC. They dismantled, once the Republicans came into power, they dismantled all of the professors who were there. They were fired, and Southerners refused to enroll, to the threat that I forget who at the time, but they threatened to start enrolling Black folks if African Americans, if whites weren't going to be enrolling. And so UNC was really viewed as a symbol throughout this area, and I would say throughout North Carolina in many ways.
The next question is for the students, Kayla and Allison. Have you been surprised in how your work has been received, either positive or negative? And any examples that you would like to share on the reception of your work?
The work that me and my peers have been doing has been received. We've gotten a lot of positive input into our project. We've worked with a lot of religious leaders who have nothing but good words to say about our project. But I wouldn't be surprised if there is some pushback because what we're trying to do is a public memorial for everyone to see, which I could see would be, people would be opposed to that. So while we haven't seen anything yet, I wouldn't be surprised if something came.
On my end at Middle Creek, I've been doing this since I was a freshman, so it's been like my entire high school career basically. And I was the only freshman in the class that started this project. And I would not stop talking about it to all of my friends. I'm pretty sure at first the reception was a little bit negative because I just annoyed them so much. I was so into this project. But because of this project, African American Literature Honors, the class exploded in terms of enrollment. It used to be a 1-block spring semester class. The next year it had 2 full classes basically. And from there we added a follow-up class. And so within my school community, the reception was absolutely positive. I was very surprised at how many people wanted to get involved into this type of thing, especially considering some of my classmates. I wasn't sure if this type of civic engagement and race relations would attract this many students. However, since the beginning of this project, we've gotten so much support from our principal and the school board. And so I'm really, really happy that this has been successful in my school community.
Can I also ask Kayla and Allison one of the questions that was there as well about how are you able to handle such hard history, right? And my colleagues in my history department, we say, well, welcome to a day of teaching U.S. history, right? Everything about it is hard. We know that. But Kayla and Allison, do you want to talk about that? How are you able to do this?
I would probably say with the support of my school community, my family, my peers, knowing that I do have people who will support me in the work that I'm doing, and knowing that while it is a horrible history, it is work that needs to be done and be recognized. So I'm willing to maybe be down a few days if this allows people to know more about this history.
For me, I have a little bit, it's not a positive answer to how I handled this lynching investigation, but to be very honest, my entire childhood, I've seen videos of police brutality randomly coming up on my phone. And when you see that all the time, like I was 9 when Trayvon Martin was killed in 2016, I was 13 when we had Philando Castile and Alton Sterling back to back within the same week. I was in middle school, I believe, when that happened. So I kind of grew up with that type of violence against the Black community, which I think kind of prepared me to take in something like lynching. So whereas it wasn't surprising and shocking, but it was just more of a moment where I was like, okay, this is where it's connecting to what I'm seeing every day anyways. And that's what really inspired me to fully understand what is happening in the real world.
The next question is for Paris and Seth. And they want to know, is it possible for you to speak more about the role of white women in directly perpetrating, accommodating, implicitly participating in lynchings, and how they may have benefit from lynchings?
What do you think, Paris? Do you want to go first?
You can, well, I'll go first. I think, that's one of the things that Ida B. Wells really focused on, was this double standard that was at play when we think about the sexual politics in the South. Undoubtedly, white men had access to Black women's bodies, and they exercised that, and many Black women were raped by white men, but they were never brought to justice or met the same fate as many Black men did. And, you know, Wells went on this crusade to really point out time and time again of incident after incident of the relationships between Black men and white women. And this was really taboo. And, you know, there was a case of a prominent wife of a doctor who, you know, ran off and eloped with a Black man, very similar to Manly Macaulay's situation. And so when white women would engage in real relationships with Black men and they would be found out, they would cry rape as a means to absolve themselves of what was viewed as unacceptable and taboo within Southern respectability, you know, how dare. And so white women became this symbol. We see it in newspaper clippings, but we see it in the white campaign, the white supremacist campaign, where white women were used as a thing to be protected, you know, and they become to symbolize the South in that way. And moving forward, we see how this cry of white women is also played out in our current history right now, in our current times, when a Black man is watching birds in a park in New York and a white woman can just call the police on him because how dare he say something to her about putting her dog on a leash. And so that was a clear, very contemporary cry of a white woman that could have led to the killing and lynching of a Black man.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, really just amplifying that, you know, historically, you know, one of the great tragedies of history is the way in which white supremacy and racism has interfered with different groups of people's capacity to understand that their commonalities exceed their differences and have, that sounds a little bit banal, but it's unfortunate that white women during enslavement or white women in the Jim Crow period weren't able to see that their own vulnerabilities gave them something in common with Black women that could have formed a cross-racial coalition. And attempts were made at that. Attempt was made in Wilmington in 1898, right, Paris, when there was a biracial government in Wilmington, when people identified that they shared interest across racial categories.
Yeah, that fusion party, absolutely.
Exactly, and this is what so infuriates people, right? Is the model of Black and white people working together, not even, you know, for some modern vision of justice, just for kind of survival and getting along, right, or getting by. But we have white female enslavers who own slaves and drive them hard in the slave era. We have white women in the Jim Crow era who benefit from and accelerate white supremacy. We know that the woman who alleged that Emmett Till whistled at her was telling a story about his behavior, and that story resulted in his lynching and murder in Mississippi in 1955. We do also know that there were some white female activists who identified that they were being used by white men in order to justify this terror campaign. And the data says, and again, I don't want to focus on the accusations that led to these lynchings, but the data says that only about 30% of lynchings were connected with an accusation of rape, which is less than we might think given the power of that myth that we hear reinforced. But a woman named Jessie Daniel Ames started something called the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, I believe it was. And what this association tried to do was to bind white women together with a compact that said, we reject white men's explanation that protecting white women is a legitimate explanation for lynching. Because we had people on the floor of the United States Senate saying that we are lynching people in the Southland to protect the flower of white womanhood. And it's all written down. And this woman, Jessie Daniel Ames, who is a Texan, said, don't use us as an explanation for this practice. We reject it. And she actually sent out a pledge that got 40,000 signatures from white women in the South. Segregated organization would not admit Black women, but sent out this and got 40,000 white women to sign to say, don't use us. And she also tried, and this is something that I've only read about a little bit and I want to explore more. She also tried to get police and sheriffs to sign on to a pledge that they would prevent lynchings. And I do not know the disposition of that, but it's a wonderful question. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Along the line of teaching hard history, Matt, can you talk about some of the pushback you got from wanting to create a class for high school students, or if you received any at all?
To be honest, there hasn't really been any. I've experienced nothing but support from my district. That first group of students who were with Kayla did a presentation for our school board, talking about the impact that doing this work had on them as students. And in the first time, in almost 20 years of teaching, I had a area superintendent for instruction come to my classroom, didn't do a speech, didn't do a presentation for the kids, came in with a pad and a piece of paper and a pen and sat down and said, "What do I need to know?" And the kids lit them up for 90 minutes about what they wanted to know, that they felt like they weren't being taught. And, you know, my principal at the district level, everybody has kind of opened the door for us to go down this path. I'm sure there are those out there who have some opposing ideas about whether we should do this. We all see it in the news about whether or not it should be the 1776 project and not the 1619 project. But one of the things is that we have the truth, right? This is a symposium on Ida B. Wells. We got to talk about shining the light of truth. We have the truth on our side. These are not opinions. You know, they throw that term around about indoctrination, about how we indoctrinate students in our America's public schools. These are facts, right? We're not giving our opinions here. You know, the forced removal of Native Americans in the 1830s in North Carolina is a fact. Forced sterilizations during the eugenics program is a fact. The 1898 massacre in Wilmington is a fact. So that's one of those things that I kind of have that armor ready for if that pushback were to come to my doorstep. I always have the truth on our side for this. But to be honest, there really hasn't been pushback. And I think people see how engaged students are by doing this work. It's undeniable. So, you know, I can only speak highly of Wake County Public Schools and how much they've supported this work and really opened doors for us, not put barriers in our way.
Okay, and
Actually, can I jump in real quick? In terms of like really shining the light, you know, and that's, you know, kind of the theme that we've been using with this whole symposium, month-long symposium with Ida B. Wells. We also need to like realize that, you know, there are those who are trying to, you know, keep this history in the dark because it doesn't serve their purpose. And so, you know, I want to talk about going back to, you know, the role that universities play and how UNC, you know, plays a role, even to this day when we think about the fraternal orders on some of these campuses. There was a July of this year, there was an article by a young man. It was entitled the Campus Confederate Legacy that, you know, we're not talking about. And he speaks to Kappa Alpha, which is a fraternity that was started in 1865, and how their ties are very closely linked to the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, they immortalize General Lee. And so when we're talking about those who want to rewrite history, keep this history in the dark, there is a paper trail that, you know, follows this history. When we go to, when we look at the chapter and what they talked about Kappa Alpha in their 1915 review of Birth of a Nation that they published in their journal, you know, they were revering this film. And so today, when we're looking at our campuses and we're looking at discussions around Silent Sam and what it means, and it's not about racism, there's a paper trail to really follow this. And all we have to do is go and look for it. It's there, and continue to shine light on it because it's there.
And what's exciting is that, yeah, and what's exciting is that people like you, Paris, and Ms. Winter and Mr. Sheldon and Kayla and Allison, you're the ones who are rewriting history, but that's a good thing, actually, because the first version of it that was written from an explicitly white supremacist perspective. And this isn't just me as like a communist, liberal, indoctrinator, college professor trying to tell you lies about the past. We just have to listen to what they had to say at the time. Just listen to what Julian Carr said when he dedicated the Confederate monument on the UNC campus, right? And so the rewriting work is about truth. And that's the work you're doing. It's very inspiring.
Yeah, and to Seth's point, I mean, we know the Daughters of the Confederacy were really effective in framing that white history, right? and it's not the case anymore, right? And Allison and Kayla are really evidence of that. And there's a question in the chat from actually Sammy Tucker, who's a member of the Freedom Struggle Committee. So hi, Sammy. And Sammy asked Kayla and Allison both if you guys would talk about what you hope your legacy of the work is.
I would say that I hope the legacy of the work that we're doing is to make other students like Kayla and I really lift their voices and be able to rewrite history correctly, and to show that we are powerful enough as we are, and to make them be able to not fear backlash of them fighting for what's right.
That's a really good question. I think what I would hope that this investigation and both of the classes would help my peers realize that learning does not stop like at high school, or it doesn't stop at university, and it doesn't stop when you take the exam. Because like I said earlier, I've taken all of North Carolina's requirements for American and North Carolina history. This was left out. Eugenics was left out. 1898 was left out. And so the idea that while we do learn a lot in school, it does not cover everything, and that you have to go beyond not those barriers or limitations, but go beyond the lines that were already drawn for you to educate yourself. Like, the only person who can really, really get you to understand something the way you need to understand it is yourself. And for me and my peers in doing this lynching investigation, it was actually looking at the original sources. It wasn't reading a textbook. It was actually going out into the community. And so I think the legacy, I guess, at my school and in our district is just to understand that we don't know everything after high school. I don't know everything even after this lynching investigation. And I know that, and I want to learn more. I hope this inspires my peers to also do the same.
And for one of the final, the final question, how do we get these revisions into our North Carolina civics, social studies, history books, and curriculum?
well, Matt's had a lot of experience talking curriculum at the county level, at least, and then maybe statewide as well. And I can speak to it as a member of the history department at my school. And I mean, I've been at Raleigh Charter now for 10 years, and the Wilmington coup was taught by my colleague Shane Klein the first year she started teaching there. So my perspective is it's already happening, and it's not just happening in our school. Allison can attest to that. The history classes that she's had, this is from a very obvious perspective of we need to confront the truth, as Ibram Kendi says, right? We need to confront the truth that where we look at the structure that was put in place, positioning white bodies over black bodies. And so if we can expand that and do what Matt is pushing for to happen on an actual like codified level, then I think that would be great. But I do know that it's happening maybe on these micro levels. But Matt, Allison, Kayla, do you want to speak to this too?
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think it's in motion. It's in play right now. Right now, we have some educators throughout the state that are already moving forward and have been moving forward over the past couple of years doing this. Sadly, I think it's going to take a generation of teachers to really make this the new norm. I think teachers, oftentimes we teach what we were taught, how we were taught it. And if I know that I was never taught these things, so coming into the classroom, like Kayla was saying about being a lifelong learner, I've had to teach myself so much of this because it's not sitting right there in the curriculum for me to use as a teacher. So I have to go do that additional work in order to bring that into the classroom for my students. So I think it's going to be when we see the Kaylas and the Allisons coming into the classroom, when we see their generation coming in, then that's going to become the new norm. So I think we're still a good few years out before it becomes kind of, that's what status quo becomes in the teaching of North Carolina and United States history. But it's moving, and that's the thing that gives me hope, is that it's moving and more people are coming to the table.
Yeah, and like, shame on us, like as a community. We can't allow teachers to just shoulder this. You know, I homeschool my son, and so I'm constantly trying to bring forward to him what is not in a book, that has not, that the light of truth has not, you know, yet to be shined on. And so if we, you know, continue as parents to raise the Kaylas and the Allisons, so then they can, you know, step into these roles. I mean, it's a collective, it's a holistic communal effort that has to come into play. We can't just expect teachers to be advocating. We as a community, we have to step up. Parents, if you want this for your kids, then you have to fight for it. And I think students also have to play a huge role in that as well, because I'm sure everyone here is just completely impressed with Kayla and Allison and the work that they're doing. So I just see bright futures for these young ladies, really. So proud of you both.
Thank you. If I could add on, I think for me, it starts with redefining how we learn in general. Most of my history classes are very textbook based, and I love learning. However, reading from a textbook is very impersonal. I think history is the one subject where you can learn from the actual people who were there, using primary sources and reading like their diaries and like whatever videos they've produced in the past, whatever. I think it needs to be a personal experience, much like this investigation was. And making sure that we have a variety of perspectives. The reason why a lot of these things were left out is because textbook writers are writing in the third person, and they are trying to get a very general idea of what happened over the course of time. But when you switch the narrative, so the actual people are telling us what happened, all of a sudden it isn't Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. It becomes Christopher Columbus met the Native Americans, and this is also what the Native Americans thought of him in return. It's making sure all voices are heard and making sure it's also engaging, because textbooks are not the most interesting thing to read. And oftentimes with that third person type of narrative, things are skewed. I was reading amazing book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. And one of the first things that he said is that for history majors, when they go to college, history is like the one subject where you have to kind of unlearn the K-12 system, because textbooks and some learning plans, they're either completely inaccurate or they skew things to favor certain people and idolize certain people, when in reality, that's not what happened. And so I think just coming at history is not something that has to be pretty and beautiful and patriotic. That's the first step in order to truly serve the people in this country.
And if I could just add on to what everybody else was saying, I would definitely agree with what Kayla was saying about we need to redefine our education system and our learning. And I would also just like to add, I've at Raleigh Charter had the privilege of my teachers, including Miss Winter and my American history, U.S. history teacher, Ms. Klein, they have taught us the brutal history of what happened, haven't really sugarcoated anything. So I think we definitely need more teachers like them and Mr. Chaldone to really show their students actual history and what actually happened, and to raise students to be able to go out into their individual communities and teach their communities about what they learned.
All right, thank you. Before we leave, are there any final thoughts you want to share with the audience? Anybody? Okay, if not, I want to give a huge thank you to our amazing panelists, and thank you to our audience for hanging in here with this interesting and very enlightening presentation. Be sure to register for our upcoming events. The next session is on October 18th at 3 p.m. and it will be Catherine Hunter Williams, a teaching associate professor of dramatic art at UNC Chapel Hill. She will conduct a stage reading of Miss Ida B. Wells by the late playwright and civil rights activist Indesha Ida Mae Holland. This matinee session is moderated by Diane Robertson and Dr. Gloria Thomas. Thank you again for this wonderful evening. Good night.
The sponsors of this event series are Free Spirit Freedom and Mentor North Carolina, Chapel Hill-Carborro branch of the NAACP, Orange County Human Relations Commission, Human Kindness Foundation. Coming to the table, Rogers Eubanks Neighborhood Association, United Church of Chapel Hill, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Center for the Study of the American South, Sonia Haynes Stone Center at UNC Chapel Hill, Center for Civil Rights at the UNC Law School, Orange County Arts Commission, Marion Cheek Jackson Center, Chapel Hill Public Library, Carolina K-12 of Carolina Public Humanities, and members of the Orange County community.